The sunset painted golden streaks across the sky as Officer Mike Wilson drove his patrol car through the quiet streets of Pinewood. At 43, he'd spent 15 years with the Pinewood Police Department. His colleagues knew him as a tough cop, but what they didn't talk about were the 6 complaints of racial profiling filed against him over the years. Each time, the department had cleared him. Each time, his belief that he was just doing his job had only grown stronger. As Wilson turned onto Maple Avenue, he spotted a sleek black BMW making a right turn. The car didn't come to a complete stop at the sign, not unusual in this part of town, but Wilson's eyes narrowed. The driver was a black man in a suit. Without hesitation, Wilson flipped on his lights. Inside the BMW, Judge Robert Hayes felt his stomach tighten at the flash of police lights in his rearview mirror. Even after 30 years as a respected criminal court judge, that familiar anxiety returned instantly. He checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His tags were current, his lights working. With a deep sigh, he'd guided his car to the curb, already running through the routine in his head, the one his father had taught him decades ago. License and registration ready on the dashboard, both hands visible on the steering wheel. Yes, sir, no sudden movements. Officer Wilson took his time approaching the vehicle, hand resting near his holster, a detail that didn't escape the judge's notice. The evening air felt thick with tension as Wilson finally reached the driver's window and shined his flashlight directly into Hayes' face. License and registration, Wilson demanded, not bothering with a greeting or explanation for the stop. Good evening, officer, Hayes responded calmly, his voice measured from years of courtroom experience. My license and registration are on the dashboard. May I reach for them? Wilson's eyes traveled over the expensive car, the tailored suit, making assumptions with each glance. Just hand them over slowly, he said, his tone suggesting he expected trouble. Hayes carefully retrieved his documents and passed them to Wilson, who barely glanced at them before asking, Where are you coming from this time of night? This isn't your neighborhood, is it? The judge had lived just 3 blocks away for over 20 years. I'm heading home from work, officer, Hayes replied, maintaining eye contact despite the flashlight still aimed at his face. I've lived in Pinewood for 2 decades. May I ask why you pulled me over? Wilson's expression hardened. You rolled through that stop sign back there, and I'll ask the questions here. Have you been drinking tonight? A young couple walking their dog slowed down across the street, watching the interaction with concerned expressions. The woman discreetly took out her phone. Hayes felt a familiar weight pressing down on him, the same weight he carried since childhood, through law school, and even to the bench. No matter his achievements, moments like these reminded him that some people would always see his skin color first. No, officer, I haven't been drinking, Hayes answered, his judicial demeanor hiding the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He presided over hundreds of cases where traffic stops like this one had escalated for no good reason. He knew exactly how dangerous this moment could be. Step out of the vehicle, Wilson ordered suddenly. Officer, I'd like to know the reason that's necessary, Hayes responded, his heart rate increasing despite his calm exterior. I've provided my identification and... I said step out of the vehicle, sir, Wilson interrupted, his hand moving back toward his holster. Now. As Hayes carefully reached for his door handle, he noticed more onlookers gathering. A teenage boy had joined the couple across the street, all of them recording now. The weight of being watched, of being a black man interacting with police while others waited for something to go wrong, sat heavily on his shoulders. What happened next would change both men's lives forever. Judge Hayes stepped carefully out of his BMW, movements deliberate and slow. The evening air had grown cooler, but small beads of sweat formed at his temples. This wasn't his first encounter like this, not by a long shot. Each time brought back memories, being pulled over with his college roommates 25 years ago, questioned for hours while the white driver was left alone. The time he was handcuffed outside his own home when a neighbor reported a suspicious man in a suit carrying a briefcase. Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle, Officer Wilson commanded, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Officer, I'd like to understand why this is necessary, Hayes said, not moving yet. I acknowledged I might not have come to a complete stop, but this level of... I said turn around. Wilson's voice rose sharply. This isn't a debate. Across the street, the young woman filming whispered to her boyfriend, "Wait, isn't that the judge from the Chen case last year?" Her boyfriend squinted in the fading light, then nodded slowly in recognition. Hayes turned reluctantly, placing his palms flat on the roof of his car. The cool metal against his hands contrasted with the heat of humiliation rising in his chest. He was thinking about his 16-year-old son, who would be waiting at home for their Friday night basketball game. What would he tell him this time? "Spread your feet," Wilson ordered, moving closer. "Officer Wilson," Hayes said quietly, reading the nameplate, "I want to cooperate fully, but I believe you're not following standard procedure for a simple traffic violation. Could you please state for my understanding what departmental protocol you're following right now?" The precise, formal language caught Wilson off guard. Most people either got angry or scared, not calmly questioning procedure. "Listen, I don't need you telling me how to do my job," Wilson replied, his voice tense. "I've got reasonable suspicion, Of what crime exactly?" Hayes asked, still facing away. Because failure to come to a complete stop doesn't typically warrant a search. By now, several more people had gathered on the sidewalk. A middle-aged woman approached from the nearby coffee shop, phone already recording. "Oh my goodness," she said loudly. "That's Judge Hayes. He's the one who helped my nephew get into that rehabilitation program instead of jail." Wilson hesitated, his hand frozen midway to Hayes' shoulder. "Judge." Hayes turned slowly to face him, maintaining eye contact. "Robert Hayes, criminal court. I'd show you my courthouse ID, but it's in my wallet, which you have in your hand." Wilson glanced down at the wallet he'd taken from Hayes' documents. He flipped it open and saw the gold judicial badge gleaming under the streetlight. His throat tightened. The small crowd had grown to about a dozen people now, phones out, witnesses to everything. Someone in the back called out, "You okay, Judge Hayes?" Hayes nodded without breaking eye contact with Wilson. "I'd like my wallet returned, please." Wilson's training told him to maintain control of the situation, but something was shifting in his mind. The ground beneath his feet suddenly felt unsteady. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. "I still need to run your license," Wilson said, but his voice had lost its edge. "That's your right," Hayes replied evenly. "And it's my right to ask why I was really stopped tonight. Was it the car, or was it something else?" The question hung in the air between them, impossibly heavy. Wilson's radio crackled, breaking the silence. "Unit 47, this is dispatch. We've received several calls about your traffic stop on Maple. Is everything 10 to 4? Wilson hesitated, then reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Wilson. I'm conducting a routine traffic stop." His eyes never left Hayes. "Actually, I may need a supervisor at this location." Hayes' expression shifted slightly, not surprise exactly, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. This wasn't going the way these stops usually went. The crowd murmured as Wilson finally handed Hayes back his wallet, license, and registration. "Please return to your vehicle, sir," Wilson said stiffly. "My supervisor will want to speak with both of us." As Hayes turned toward his car, Wilson noticed for the first time the bumper sticker partially visible in the growing darkness. "Equality under the law, Pinewood Bar Association." And for the briefest moment, Wilson felt something unfamiliar, doubt. 5 minutes felt like an hour as Judge Hayes sat in his car while Officer Wilson paced near his patrol vehicle. The crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, it had grown larger. Hayes could see people talking, pointing, some still recording. He'd spent his career trying to build bridges between law enforcement and the community, yet here he was, caught in the very divide he'd worked to close. Hayes checked his watch. His son would be wondering where he was. He picked up his phone, then hesitated when he saw Wilson watching him through the rearview mirror. Even now, he was conscious of how his movements might be perceived. Slowly, he put the phone down. A second police car pulled up, its lights cutting through the gathering darkness. Lieutenant Diane Chen stepped out, her expression all business as she surveyed the scene. Hayes recognized her from several community policing initiatives he'd supported. "Officer Wilson," she said as she approached. "What's the situation here?" Wilson straightened his posture. "Traffic violation, Lieutenant. Driver rolled through a stop sign. When I approached, he became uncooperative." Hayes watched through his side mirror as Lieutenant Chen's eyes darted to the crowd, Then back to Wilson. "And I'm guessing that's why we have half the neighborhood out filming?" she asked quietly. "The driver is apparently some judge," Wilson replied, his voice tight. People recognized him. Lieutenant Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. "What judge?" "Hayes. Criminal court." The lieutenant's expression changed immediately. "Judge Robert Hayes? The one who heads the community justice program?" Wilson nodded stiffly. "Wait here," she instructed him, then walked toward Hayes' car. Hayes rolled down his window as she approached. "Judge Hayes," she said, her tone professional but respectful. "I'm Lieutenant Chen. I apologize for the inconvenience tonight." "Lieutenant," Hayes acknowledged with a nod. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this stop." "I'm sure we can clear this up quickly," she said. "May I ask what happened from your perspective?" Hayes glanced past her to where Wilson stood, arms crossed defensively. "I was pulled over, allegedly for not making a complete stop. Officer Wilson immediately escalated the situation, asking me to exit my vehicle without explanation and attempting to conduct a search that seemed unwarranted for a minor traffic violation." Lieutenant Chen frowned. "I see. Would you be willing to step out so we can discuss this further? I assure you, you're not being detained." Hayes considered for a moment, then nodded. As he stepped out of his car, someone from the crowd called out, "You tell them, Judge." Lieutenant Chen turned to address the onlookers. "Folks, please give us some space to resolve this." Hayes stood tall beside his car, straightening his suit jacket. "Lieutenant, I'd like to be clear about something. I'm not looking to file a complaint or cause problems for your department. But what happened here tonight is part of a pattern that needs addressing." Officer Wilson had moved closer, listening with a reddening face. "This wasn't just about a stop sign," Hayes continued. "When Officer Wilson saw me, a black man in an expensive car, he made assumptions. The same assumptions that have followed me my entire life, regardless of my education, my position, or my contributions to this community." Wilson stepped forward, unable to contain himself. "With all due respect, sir, you don't know what I was thinking. I was following procedure for a traffic violation. Were you?" Hayes challenged, his voice still calm but firm. "Is it standard procedure to order someone out of their vehicle for rolling through a stop sign? To prepare for a search without probable cause?" "I had reasonable suspicion," Wilson insisted, though his voice wavered slightly. "Of what?" Hayes asked. "That's what I've been trying to understand." Lieutenant Chen cut in. "Officer Wilson, step back, please." But Hayes raised his hand. "No, Lieutenant. This conversation needs to happen. Officer Wilson and I need to understand each other." The crowd had grown silent, watching the three figures illuminated by headlights and street lamps. "I've sat on the bench for nearly 20 years, Hayes said, looking directly at Wilson. "I've seen thousands of cases come through my courtroom. I know the difference between proper police procedure and profiling. What happened tonight wasn't about public safety. It was about bias, maybe unconscious, but bias nonetheless." Wilson's jaw tightened. "You can't just throw around accusations like that." "They're not accusations," Hayes replied. "They're observations based on experience, mine and countless others who look like me." The tension between them had reached a breaking point. Something had to give. The crowd stood silent, watching the three figures in the street, Judge Hayes, Officer Wilson, and Lieutenant Chen, their faces lit by the harsh glow of police lights. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Lieutenant Chen looked from Hayes to Wilson, then made a decision. "Let's move this conversation somewhere more private," she suggested, gesturing toward the coffee shop across the street. Hayes shook his head. "With respect, Lieutenant, privacy is part of the problem. These situations happen every day, but they stay hidden. Maybe it's time people witnessed the uncomfortable conversations that need to happen." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Wilson shifted his weight uncomfortably, feeling all eyes on him. "Fine," Lieutenant Chen agreed reluctantly. "But let's be constructive." Hayes turned to face Wilson directly. "Officer, I want you to understand something. I'm angry right now. Not just about tonight, but about the countless times I've been in this position. About the fact that I've had to teach my son what to do when, not if, but when, he gets pulled over unjustly." Wilson's face hardened. "Sir, with all due respect, I was doing my job. If you had just cooperated..." I did cooperate, Hayes interrupted, his voice still measured but firm. I provided my documents. I answered your questions. I even stepped out of the car when ordered, despite having no legal obligation to do so for a simple traffic violation. A person from the crowd called out, "That's right." Lieutenant Chen raised a hand to quiet them. Wilson's frustration boiled over. "Look, not everything is about race. You broke a traffic law. End of story." "Is it?" Hayes asked. He pointed to a white pickup truck rolling through the same stop sign down the block. "Would you have pulled that driver over too?" Wilson opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. "I've been on the bench long enough to see patterns," Hayes continued. "The same offenses, but different outcomes depending on who committed them. Different charges, different bail amounts, different sentences." Lieutenant Chen cut in. "Judge Hayes, I understand your frustration, but what do you want to happen here? Do you want to file a complaint against Officer Wilson?" The question hung in the air. Everyone waited for Hayes' answer. He looked at Wilson, really looked at him, and saw something beneath the defensiveness. Uncertainty? Fear? Perhaps both. After a long moment, Hayes made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "No," he said clearly, "I don't want to file a complaint." Wilson's shoulders relaxed slightly, but Hayes wasn't finished. "What I want," he continued, "is for Officer Wilson to spend 1 week observing in my courtroom." The unexpected suggestion seemed to catch Wilson completely off guard. "What? 1 week?" Hayes repeated. "You'll sit in my courtroom. Watch the cases. See the people who come through, who gets charged with what, who can afford bail and who can't, who gets a second chance and who doesn't. See the system from the other side of the bench." Lieutenant Chen looked baffled. "Judge Hayes, that's an unusual request." "Maybe," Hayes acknowledged. "But filing a complaint would just create more division, more anger, more defensiveness. Nothing would change." He looked back at Wilson. "I'm offering you a chance to see why this matters so much. Not just to me, but to our entire community." Wilson stared at him, suspicious. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'd file the complaint," Hayes said simply. "And we both know there are enough witnesses here to support my version of events." The crowd had grown silent again, captivated by the unexpected turn. Wilson looked at Lieutenant Chen, who gave a small nod. "It's your call," she told him. Wilson turned back to Hayes, studying the judge's face. This wasn't how these situations were supposed to go. There was supposed to be anger, accusations, paperwork, not whatever this was. "Why would you do this?" Wilson finally asked. "Why not just report me and be done with it?" Hayes' expression softened slightly. "Because, Officer Wilson, in my experience, punishment rarely leads to understanding. And without understanding, nothing ever changes." The crowd watched, holding their breath, as Wilson considered the offer. His whole career, his identity as a police officer, seemed to hang in the balance of this moment. 1 week, Wilson finally said, his voice quiet but clear. "That's it." Hayes nodded, extending his hand. 1 week. After a moment's hesitation, Wilson took it. Monday morning arrived with a light drizzle as Officer Wilson climbed the courthouse steps. He'd spent the weekend dreading this moment. His fellow officers had given him a hard time when they heard about the deal he'd made. Some thought he should have refused. Others were just curious about what went on in Judge Hayes' courtroom. Wilson straightened his tie. He'd opted for civilian clothes today and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The courthouse bustled with activity. Lawyers huddled with clients. Court officers directed traffic. Families waited anxiously on wooden benches. He checked the directory, found Hayes' courtroom number, and made his way up the stairs. Outside courtroom 4B, he hesitated. What exactly was he walking into? Would Hayes humiliate him? Use him as some kind of object lesson? Taking a deep breath, Wilson pushed open the door. Inside, the courtroom was already filling up. Hayes wasn't on the bench yet. A court clerk noticed Wilson standing awkwardly by the door. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm Officer Wilson. Judge Hayes is expecting me." Recognition flashed across her face. "Right, he mentioned you'd be joining us this week. You can sit there," she pointed to a chair just behind the prosecutor's table. Wilson took his seat, feeling strangely exposed without his uniform. A few minutes later, the bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Hayes entered. Hayes looked different in his black robes, somehow both more imposing and more at ease. He nodded slightly to Wilson before taking his seat. "First case," Hayes announced. The morning proceeded with a blur of cases: drug possession, theft, assault. Wilson watched as defendants came before the judge. Most were represented by overworked public defenders. Many couldn't afford bail. Hayes listened to each case carefully, asking questions, considering options. During a brief recess, Wilson found himself standing next to the water cooler when Hayes approached. "Your impressions so far, Officer Wilson?" Hayes asked, filling a paper cup. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "You're not what I expected." "How so?" "You're tough on the violent cases." "I thought you'd be more." He searched for the word. "Lenient?" Hayes supplied. "Maybe." Hayes studied him for a moment. "Justice isn't about being tough or lenient. It's about seeing the whole picture. That's what I want you to understand this week." Before Wilson could respond, the bailiff announced the end of recess. After lunch, a case caught Wilson's attention. A young black man, barely 20, stood accused of possessing a small amount of marijuana. The prosecutor pushed for the maximum penalty, citing 2 previous arrests. Wilson had made dozens of similar arrests himself. "Mr. Thomas," Judge Hayes addressed the defendant, "I see from your file that you're working 2 jobs while attending community college." The young man nodded nervously. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm studying computer programming." Hayes leaned forward. "And you're supporting your grandmother?" "Yes, sir. She raised me after my mom died." Hayes considered this, then looked at the prosecutor. "The court recognizes that Mr. Thomas has made poor choices. However, I'm not convinced that jail time serves either justice or public safety in this case." Wilson watched, surprised, as Hayes ordered probation and community service instead of jail time. Even more surprising, he connected the young man with a court liaison for job training programs. "Next case," Hayes called. As the afternoon wore on, Wilson began noticing patterns. Hayes was indeed tough on violent crimes, but for non-violent offenders, especially young ones, he often found alternatives to incarceration. He seemed to know details about community programs, treatment options, and support services that Wilson had never heard of. By the end of the day, Wilson's head was spinning with new perspectives. As the courtroom emptied, Hayes motioned him forward. "I'd like you to follow a specific case tomorrow," Hayes said, handing Wilson a file. "This young man was arrested last month in your precinct, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer." Wilson frowned, taking the file. "Sounds like he deserves whatever he gets." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "That's the attitude I'm hoping might evolve this week. Read the file." The officer's body camera footage tells a different story than the arrest report. "What are you suggesting?" Wilson asked defensively. "I'm not suggesting anything," Hayes replied calmly. "I'm asking you to look at all the evidence, just as I must do. See you tomorrow, Officer Wilson." As Wilson left the courthouse, clutching the file, he felt uneasy. He'd come here expecting to confirm his beliefs about judges like Hayes, soft on crime, anti-police, playing the race card. Instead, he'd witnessed something more complex. Hayes was firm but fair, tough but thoughtful. Walking to his car, Wilson opened the file and began to read. Wilson spent half the night reading through the case file Judge Hayes had given him. The defendant was Andrew Parker, a 19-year-old arrested for resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. According to the police report, Parker had become combative during a routine stop. But the body camera footage told a different story, showing a frightened teenager who'd raised his hands defensively when an officer grabbed him roughly. The next morning, Wilson arrived at the courthouse early, thoughts still tangled from what he'd seen in the file. He found Hayes in his chambers, reviewing documents. "You watched the footage?" Hayes asked without looking up. "Yes," Wilson admitted, settling into a chair across from the judge. "The report doesn't match what happened." Hayes finally looked at him. "That happens more often than you might think." "So what happens to the officer who'd filed the false report?" "Nothing, most likely," Hayes said. "The case against Parker will probably be dismissed today, and everyone will move on." Wilson frowned. "That doesn't seem right." "No," Hayes agreed. "It doesn't." Parker's case was third on the docket that morning. Wilson watched as the young man entered the courtroom, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. His public defender looked tired, clutching a coffee cup like a lifeline. The prosecutor, after a brief whispered exchange with the defender, approached the bench. Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Parker. Hayes nodded. Motion granted. Mr. Parker, you're free to go. The young man looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. That's it. That's it, Hayes confirmed. As Parker turned to leave, Hayes called after him. Mr. Parker, a moment please. Parker froze, clearly expecting the other shoe to drop. I understand you're working on your GED, Hayes asked. Parker nodded cautiously. Yes, sir. My clerk has information about a program at the community center, part-time work while you complete your education. Stop by her desk before you leave. Thank you, Your Honor, Parker said, the tension visibly leaving his body. As court continued, Wilson found himself watching the faces more than listening to the cases, the relieved smile of a mother when her son was given probation instead of jail time. The grim determination of a victim finding courage to testify. The weary resignation of repeat offenders who'd lost hope. During the lunch break, Wilson overheard two public defenders talking. Got Henderson today, one said, sipping coffee. Good luck with that, the other replied. That guy's never met a black defendant he didn't want to lock up for maximum time. Wilson felt his face grow hot. Was that how officers like him were seen? As automatically biased against certain defendants. After lunch, a case came up that stopped Wilson cold. The defendant was Kevin Wright, a teenager charged with shoplifting and running from police. Wilson recognized him immediately. Had arrested the kid himself just 6 months earlier for a similar offense. This time, rather than simply processing the case, Hayes did something unexpected. He came down from the bench and sat at the table with Wright, speaking to him directly. Kevin, this is your second offense in 6 months. Tell me what's going on. The teenager stared at his hands. Nothing, sir. Your grandmother's sick, isn't she? Hayes pressed. And you've been missing school to take care of her. Wright looked up, surprised. How did you know that? I make it my business to know the people who come into my courtroom, Hayes replied. The store owner says you took food and medicine. Is that right? Wright nodded, eyes filling with tears. We ran out of money after her last hospital stay. I tried to get a job, but nobody would hire me. Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When he'd arrested Wright, he hadn't asked any questions. He'd just seen another punk kid breaking the law. Hayes turned to the prosecutor. I'm ordering a diversion program for Mr. Wright, community service at the food bank where he'll bring home a weekly box for his family. And I want someone from social services to visit his grandmother today to arrange proper home care. As Wright left the courtroom, escorted by a social worker, his face showed something Wilson hadn't seen during the arrest. Hope. At the end of the day, Hayes found Wilson sitting alone in the empty courtroom. You've been quiet today, the judge observed. Wilson looked up. I arrested that kid. Right. Never even asked why he was stealing. Hayes sat in the gallery beside him. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Is that how you see police officers? As hammers? No, Hayes said thoughtfully. I see police officers as people with an incredibly difficult job who sometimes lose sight of the humans they're policing. Wilson was quiet for a long moment. That teenager today, he reminded me of my brother. Hayes waited, giving him space to continue. My brother got caught shoplifting when he was 16, but the officer let him go with a warning because he was a good kid who made a mistake. He's a doctor now. Wilson's voice grew quieter. I've never given anyone that kind of break. It's not too late to start, Hayes said simply. 6 months later, on a warm spring evening, the community center in Pinewood was packed. Folding chairs filled the gymnasium, and people stood along the walls. A banner hung above the podium, Building Bridges, Police and Community Forum. Judge Hayes stood at the microphone, surveying the crowd. He spotted familiar faces, defendants from his courtroom, officers from the local precinct, community leaders, and ordinary citizens hoping for change. Thank you all for coming tonight, Hayes began. When we planned this forum, we honestly expected about 20 people. I think this turnout speaks to how much we all want the same thing, a community where everyone feels safe and respected. In the front row, Officer Wilson sat in his uniform, surprisingly calm despite knowing he would soon address the crowd. The past 6 months had changed him in ways he never expected. "I'd like to introduce someone many of you already know," Hayes continued. "Officer Mike Wilson has been working with our community outreach program since January, and he has something he'd like to share." Wilson took a deep breath and walked to the podium. Looking out at the sea of faces, black, white, young, old, he felt a nervousness that surprised him. He'd faced armed suspects with less anxiety than he felt addressing this crowd. 6 months ago, Wilson began, his voice initially unsteady. "I pulled over a black driver for rolling through a stop sign. That driver turned out to be Judge Hayes." A murmur rippled through the audience. Many remembered the incident that had been shared widely online. "What happened next changed my life," Wilson continued. "Instead of filing a complaint against me, Judge Hayes invited me to spend a week in his courtroom. At first, I thought it was a trick, maybe a way to embarrass me or get me fired." Wilson paused, looking at Hayes, who nodded encouragingly. "That week turned into 2 weeks, then a month. I saw cases I would have handled one way be resolved in ways that actually helped people. I saw teenagers who reminded me of kids I'd arrested get second chances I'd never offered them." The room was silent now, everyone leaning forward slightly. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend I had some magical transformation," Wilson said honestly. "But I did start asking questions I'd never asked before. Why did I pull over certain drivers and not others? Why did I assume guilt in some neighborhoods but give the benefit of the doubt in others?" In the third row, Wilson spotted Kevin Wright, the young shoplifter who had reminded him of his brother. Wright had completed his GED program and now worked part-time at the community center while taking classes at the local college. "For 15 years, I thought being a good cop meant making arrests and getting convictions," Wilson continued. "Now I understand that being a good cop means serving the whole community, not just protecting some people from others." Wilson gestured to a group of officers seated together. 3 months ago, we started a new training program in our department. Every new officer spends a week observing in court, just like I did. They see what happens after the arrest, after the paperwork. They see the human beings behind the case numbers." An older woman near the front wiped tears from her eyes as Wilson spoke. "We've also started a youth outreach program," Wilson added, his confidence growing. "Every Saturday, officers volunteer at the community center, coaching basketball, helping with homework, just being present not as authority figures, but as neighbors." Wilson looked directly at Hayes now. None of this would have happened if one man hadn't chosen understanding over anger, education over punishment. Judge Hayes could have ended my career that night. Instead, he changed it, and changed me in the process. Hayes nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without drawing attention to himself. "I know one forum and a few programs won't fix everything," Wilson said, looking around the room. "We have decades of mistrust to overcome. But this is a start. Real change happens one person at a time, one interaction at a time." As Wilson returned to his seat, the applause started slowly, then built. Not polite, perfunctory applause, but genuine, hopeful sound. After the forum ended, Wilson stood with Hayes near the refreshment table. A young boy approached them, perhaps 10 years old, looking nervously at Wilson's uniform. "Are you really the officer from the video?" the boy asked. "The one who stopped the judge?" Wilson knelt down to eye level with the child. "I am. Not my proudest moment." The boy considered this. "My dad says police officers don't like people who look like us." Wilson glanced at Hayes, who watched silently, letting Wilson find his own answer. "Some police officers have wrong ideas about people," Wilson said carefully. "And sometimes those wrong ideas make us do wrong things. But we can learn and change. I'm trying to do that." The boy nodded solemnly. "I want to be a police officer someday. But a good one." "The world needs good officers," Wilson replied. "Maybe by the time you're old enough, things will be different." As the boy ran back to his father, Hayes smiled. "Things are already different, Officer Wilson. Maybe not everywhere, not yet. But here with you they are." Wilson watched as people mingled, officers chatting with community members, teenagers who might once have run from police now sitting beside them, sharing pizza and conversation. One interaction, one person, one change at a time. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start.